One of Final Fantasy's cornerstones has always been its combat. The series managed to keep its turn-based approach to combat fresh and appealing for its first 10 mainline entries by varying the progression and magic system in each game. This turned players' attention towards what made those worlds unique instead of the actual combat itself in each game. But at its core, the turn-based combat was the same, with only tiny variants across each game. Yet it still managed to feel fresh until they decided to try something different. It took almost 15 years after the launch of Final Fantasy I for Square to start trying to move the needle from the traditional turn-based idea of combat towards something more innovative and modern. It wasn't until after arguably the pinnacle of turn-based combat, Final Fantasy X, where Square decided to make an innovation push away from a firmly traditional style of turn-based combat. 10 allowed us a level of strategic and dynamic combat never before seen in a mainline Final Fantasy game, giving us the ability to actively change party members during a fight and play as summons, as well as battle mechanics that gave us real-time feedback on the effects our actions would have before we even locked them in. This was the first time I ever understood the idea of innovation. These were things that shouldn't happen in a turn-based game. This wasn't how it went, but it worked great. It was the beginning of something really new. It was a dynamic combat system that felt like it was on the cusp of becoming something more than just turn-based combat. Final Fantasy X presented a double-edged sword for Square. They'd crafted a system that's still a standout of the series to this day, but where could they go from there? Following that thread for the last 20 plus years is how we've ended up with the combat we now have in the current Final Fantasy VII trilogy. Let's dive in and have a look at the past so we can ultimately predict what the future holds for us in Final Fantasy VII Part 3 and beyond. I really hope you enjoy. I think we need to fully appreciate and understand the past of Final Fantasy VII's combat before we can get a proper read on how they might turn Part 3's combat into something truly landmark, and how the series' combat trends aren't necessarily influenced just by the games. So first, we'll have a look back so we can look forward. I personally feel like the original Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core, and Advent Children are the three biggest influences on the combat in the Remake Trilogy. In the original Final Fantasy VII, the ATB system was the cornerstone of the combat. Put very simply, players would wait until their ATB bar filled, then use their turn to spend that ATB bar to perform actions in battle. These actions could be things like using regular attacks, casting magic, or even switching combat formations to defense. By default, if you didn't attack, the enemy would continuously attack you instead of waiting for you to take your turn. It was the ATB, or active time battle system, that made the game something different from the more traditional turn-based games of that era. The general turn-based style of combat outside of the ATB system, though, was pretty par for the course for a 1997 RPG and this era of Final Fantasy. VII's sleek and shiny new PS1 graphics and animation wowed us. Its truly unique, cutting-edge graphics and the depth of its themes and writing were its true competitive advantage. VII's combat, much like the games that came before it, served as the foundation for what would evolve into the combat we see now in Remake and Rebirth, but it had a lot of evolving to do before then. 8 years after the release of Final Fantasy VII, Advent Children came out. Set roughly 2 years after the events of the original game, the movie chronicles the story of the spread of a mysterious illness called geostigma through Midgar, and follows the story of how the party investigate and discover its root cause. Naturally, Shinra, Genova and Sephiroth are up to their old shenanigans, but the medium of film allowed the creators to go all out on the action and fight scenes. If you ask me, there seems to have been a conscious effort since its release in 2005 to push Final Fantasy's combat as a series towards the style of combat we see in Advent Children. It's clearly inspired by anime fight scenes and high-octane action. Advent Children showed the party dynamically working together in a way that, at the time, would never be possible in gaming. One specific fight scene with Bahamut sticks out to me as a clear inspiration as to where we might be headed for Part 3. But before that, Crisis Core needed to come along. Crisis Core was Zack Fair's prequel story and was released 3 years after Advent Children in 2008. It follows Zack's rise through the soldier ranks, expands the roster of first-class soldiers, gives us some backstory on the Buster Sword, and provides a lot of historical context on Shinra as a whole, the Wutai War, the Nibelheim incident, and the events leading up to Zack's demise on the Midgar Sands. It leaves only a couple of months of unaccounted for time between the end of Crisis Core and the events of Final Fantasy VII. In terms of gameplay, Crisis Core made a decided move towards a more dynamic combat environment. Battles were still activated mostly at random intervals during regular gameplay, but the combat wasn't as strictly turn-based as it used to be. You could control Zack and run around freely, but we hadn't quite evolved to real-time dodging just yet, so even if you run away from an enemy's hit, you'd still take damage from it if you had been physically in range when the enemy launched that attack. Zack could block manually though, allowing him to reduce incoming damage. It was an important step in speeding up combat. You no longer had to use a whole move to defend yourself. One progress point we can see is Zack's limit breaks. Even though they were randomly selected for you with the DMW slots, Zack's limit moves would see him team up with various other soldiers and Shinra operatives to deliver hard-hitting attacks. This may have even been the genesis of the idea behind the synergy attack. Visually, Crisis Core's combat wasn't too dissimilar to how Remake's combat looks, albeit far slower and clearly held back by the technology of its time. We've even seen in Crisis Core Reunion how the gameplay was tweaked to be more in line with Remake and Rebirth in the time since. So with the history thoroughly toured, let's do what we do best around here. Have a brief recap of Remake's combat and see how that evolved into Rebirth's, and then use that trend to see if we can predict some potential evolutions in Part 3's combat. Naturally with some wildcard predictions along the way too. Remake's combat is 1 part original Final Fantasy VII, 1 part Crisis Core dynamic movement, and 2 parts Advent Children cinematics. We take the ATB system from the original, but instead of making time the primary charging factor of the ATB, we let the player charge the ATB with their basic attacks, which they can now do at any time. Your ATB bars, which you can now store 2 of by default, can be spent on using character-specific abilities, weapon abilities, summons and materia. It's brilliant in its simplicity, and a great twist on the original game's combat. It liberates the player from the constraints of having to wait to fight. It's the basis of all combat for the new trilogy, and it's enough on its own to allow an average player to slash and blast their way through the whole game, even if they never understand the deeper mechanics like pressure or stagger or elemental weaknesses. Although you might have a horrible time with a couple of bosses if you don't dive into some of the finer points, the game does have a couple of nasty skill checks hidden in there. As usual though, the art is in the detail and how the game respects its history. Remake gives each character their own playstyle, harkening back to the job system of old, and makes them fully controllable. They all have full sets of both character-specific and weapon-specific abilities that, when combined, give each character their own niche that's unique to them and make them play completely differently to other characters. Cloud being the hard-hitting swordsman and all-rounder, Barrett lends himself to the ranged role, his ability buffing his defenses and tanking damage for the party. Aerith is the mage, who can deal insane magic damage when you use her abilities properly, and of course Tifa's the uppercutting, dive-kicking beast of a monk that destroys everything in the entire game with relative ease. She's really overpowered. One important thing to note about Remake's combat is that it doesn't allow for aerial combat in any meaningful way. Cloud and Tifa can zoom up and hit an aerial enemy, but they can't stay aloft or launch attacks in the air, and as far as I remember they don't actually have combos, they just do single hits. If you're following, this is something that I think is going to be important going forward, and Remake's approach to this was to very gently introduce us to the idea of aerial combat, which would become a far more prominent possibility in the game's follow-up, Rebirth. 4 years after Remake, Rebirth took almost every existing combat mechanic and either upgraded them or added a new aspect to improve them. It also added new mechanics that are undoubtedly going to be upgraded in a similar vein for Part 3's return. The first new mechanic we're introduced to is the synergy attack. Spending your ATB earns you 1 synergy charge for that character, and you can now store up to 5 ATB charges. Spend 2 or 3 ATB charges on 2 characters that you've unlocked synergy attacks for, and you can perform devastating synergy moves that are just as powerful as limit breaks. They grant a variety of boons like damage boost, stagger boost, extra ATB charges, unlimited MP for pretty long periods of time in battle, and an upgrade to your character's limit level, allowing you to access your level 2 and 3 limits within a battle. Aerial combat is now introduced in a pretty big way. Some characters have the capability to perform aerial moves once they're airborne, and now there's 2 ways to achieve that. In Cloud's case, he can launch himself completely free of charge, and launch self-sustaining aerial combos without anyone's assistance. Tifa can use the R1 synergy moves to have another character launch her into the air, so you need to have a specific party setup if you intend to use Tifa for aerial combat. If you can master it though, the moves are insanely powerful. Cloud's aerial onslaught is even the second last move that he learns in the folios, and it's right before his level 3 limit, which is his most powerful move. The R1 synergy attacks are worth noting at this point too. They're moves that can be executed free of ATB or synergy charge. Hold R1 and press one of the face button to access a move that allows characters to support each other. These are hidden gems honestly, and the game doesn't really talk about them much. In my hard mode playthroughs, I'd have been lost without skills like counterfire. It's a full block move for ranged attacks that negates all damage and fires the projectile back at the enemy, completely free from any ATB or MP usage. It's madness. They come in a variety of flavours too, from blocks to dodges to aerial launches, dash attacks and more. They're an extremely versatile evolution on Remake's combat, and I'd be willing to bet money on them making a big return for Part 3. So with Remake and Rebirth's combat recapped, let's get to the bit we all want to see, the combat evolution for Part 3. As I see it, there's a few categories that have obvious trajectories across the trilogy, given how the combat mechanics have changed from Remake into Rebirth. The synergy elephant in the room should be addressed first and foremost, I think. In Rebirth, all the synergy attacks are between 2 characters. With how powerful they already are, how could Square possibly go about improving a system that's already this powerful? Well, as I see it, Part 3 is going to have a whole new level of combat. Like I covered it in my 7 returning enemies videos, the Genji gloves allow us to break the damage cap, but I think this might need to be the default in Part 3. The endgame of Part 3 is definitely going to have extremely powerful enemies to contend with by way of Titan class enemies. Weapons, raid bosses and the planet belching out all kinds of corrupted lifestream abominations lie ahead of us. I think we're in for a world of high HP hurt in Part 3, so full party synergy attacks will be a must to contend with the larger than life enemies we're bound to face. They'll have to be balanced by each player needing 3 or more synergy charges of course, but we can only imagine that the result will be supremely cinematic. Finally, I think Square will manage to scratch that Advent Children itch that we talked about earlier, as well as deliver unparalleled, uncapped damage. The idea of there being a higher tier of combat in Part 3 to fully match the size and scale of the battle for the planet that we're going to be involved in got me thinking. Throughout Remake and Rebirth, there's been a few pretty technical fights that served as skill checks. Everyone remembers their first run-in with Hell House, right? And you probably also remember your second, third and fourth run-ins with Rufus. This new era of combat that I'm envisioning could play out in 2 ways, as I see it anyway. One is an expansion of what already exists in battles like Rufus and the Hell House, but evolved. Technical fights with mechanics that you need to figure out on the fly. Enemies that have specific defense capabilities like Hell House, or enemies that are designed as 1v1 bouts to allow for depth of combat like Roach and Rufus. I can definitely see these kinds of battles ramped up in Part 3, maybe even to include duo battles at the same depth as Rufus and Roach's fights, maybe even a 3v3 bout for the looming Turks encounter in the raid on Midgar. This level of mechanical depth adds an almost puzzle-like element to battles that I personally loved in Remake and Rebirth. The caveat though being that your party selection would have to be locked, considering the fights would have to be designed with specific characters in mind. This is what allowed the devs to really tailor the encounters to skills and abilities that they know each of those characters have. Secondly, and a little bit more of a left field suggestion, are contextual battle mechanics. As the scale of the game opens up again, we know that there are some truly gargantuan encounters coming up. Not only that, but there'll naturally be a desire to make the combat encounters that already exist deepen in some way. We know that we're bound for more reactors and larger enemies, so what better way to deepen the combat than to add contextual battle mechanics? One example of this we've already seen was in the very first boss of Remake, the Scorpion Sentinel. He has a generator on his back that has to be attacked to drop his shields. It could be really interesting to see them expand that idea in Part 3's boss fights, using one character to disable a far-off generator or exploit an enemy's weakness while the party deals damage, using arena-specific mechanics like the Ironclad in the Temple of the Ancients to deal massive damage to enemies who have even more massive health pools. It'll be a tall order, and if this mythic new level of combat comes true the way I see it, suddenly having 2/3 of your party sideline feels like a distinct disadvantage. But there might be a precedent already set in the series that allows us a new level of dynamic party control. Not only that, but this precedent happened in another Final Fantasy that was considered a mold breaker and trendsetter at the time. Final Fantasy X's party switching mechanic. Party size has remained somewhat consistent throughout the series. Earlier entries gave us 4 party members, until we normalised on a 3-fighter loadout and largely stuck to it. However, in Final Fantasy X something interesting happened. We were allowed to swap characters during the fight, free of charge. Each character was so varied and had such a unique role that they were allowed to swap in and out on the fly, and it really worked. I'd love to see Part 3 try this. For both Remake and Rebirth, there's been a limited amount of special support and command materia in the game. A finite amount of all the materia that's used to make your party truly overpowered. You can only really kit out 3 characters to be supremely powerful. Sure, if they bring back the mastering mechanic from the original where you can duplicate materia by fully upgrading it, we could make game-breaking setups. But my response to that, as we've said, is that there's probably going to be enemies in the finale that need truly powerful and all-encompassing setups to beat. If you're willing to do the farming and leveling up, why not let the party become extremely powerful and swap in and out of battles on the fly? It's worked really well for the series before, and they don't have sequels to think about this time, so why not go all out with a bang? I'm no game designer, but I struggle to see why this would have any sort of adverse effect on the game, and it will give us a level of dynamic combat never seen before in the series. After all, we kind of already did a version of this in the fight against Genova at the end of Rebirth. The characters were just swapped in and out for us. While we're on the subject of Final Fantasy X, I want to quickly throw in a little curveball and a personal wish of mine here. What if Part 3 expanded the summon mechanics and allowed us to actually control some of them like we control the characters? Obviously this would present an issue for the larger than life summons like Knights Around or the Spaceborne Bahamut Zero, but for the more terrestrial titans, allowing us to control them directly could certainly be an interesting combat twist. Maybe I should manage my expectations for this one, but there's no better time to dream big in my opinion. Letting us embody the lifestream and control supreme summons like Shiva, Ifrit and Bahamut would be a dream come true for the series in my opinion. Just look at how much of a beloved mechanic it was in Final Fantasy X, and how well it's also worked more recently in Final Fantasy XVI. I'm not going to go too deep into this one because it'll only get my hopes up, but let me know if you think it would be something you'd want to see and how you think it would work, because I think it could be great. For our final point, I'm going to go with a surefire win. I love a good speculation session, but it's also nice every now and then to ground ourselves in a mechanic that we know is coming up. We'll mix some speculation in there by wrapping it up with a question about the implications that this point could have on a specific character too. Level 4 limit breaks. The most powerful character abilities in the original game take the whole game and a ton of fighting and side questing to learn. Cloud's Omni Slash is up there as one of the most powerful moves in the entire game. There's a whole host of ways these could be evolved into something new. Personally, I think the most interesting change-up would be narratively, as usual. We've covered the point before on this channel, but I think one of the strongest development aspects of the Remake Trilogy is its depth of world building. In 1997, the world was an amazing game world, but what it didn't have was narrative and world building layered in at every level for us to see. The keen-eyed players will have noticed some subtle signals in there from side missions in Rebirth. A lot of them served as history for a certain character and furthered their own stories in a particular way. I'd be pretty confident in saying that these kind of quests in Part 3 will result in characters gaining their final limit breaks. Tifa is yet to meet Zangan again, Yuffie hasn't gone to Wutai, Vincent and Lucretia obviously haven't been explored at all. There's plenty of loose threads to be pulled on that will result in catharsis for characters and a final rounding of their abilities as I see it. I'm so excited to see how they work the top tier attacks into huge powerful moves. Although, it does present us a worrying question for one of our favourite characters.
But it's okay, cause I'm here for you, to help take the load off your shoulders. Your fears, your worries, your concerns, and yes, your fees. Whatever your problem, I got you.
Throughout Remake and Rebirth, Barret is the only character that's had all of his limit breaks. His more powerful limit breaks like Satellite Beam and Unger Max or Anger Max depending on where you played the original, were a limit break and a weapon ability respectively in Rebirth, and his level 4 limit break from the original, Catastrophe, was his level 3 limit break in Rebirth. Could this mean that the writing is on the wall for Barret? He did die in Remake after all, even though he was brought back, and if we destroy the Whispers once and for all in Part 3, are we potentially reversing their effects and sacrificing Barret in the process? One other possibility as I see it is that the level 4 limit breaks are going to include assists from characters that are specific to that character. Again, Tifa would be at her peak with help from Zangan, Yuffie with her family from Wutai, Red with help from Seto, and Cloud with help from his fragmented forms of himself across the life stream coming back together, and maybe even Zack. This could leave the door open nicely for Barret's level 4 limit to be something completely new and include an assist from Avalanche. I think we'd all love to see Jessie and Biggs and Wedge back. One thing I'm certain of though, is that they're going to be epic in scale, and a representation of the entire trilogy for that character culminating in one devastating move. So there we have it, a brief history of the combat in the relevant Final Fantasy games that have all contributed in their own way to the extremely deep combat system we have now, and a speculation on where the trajectory of those evolutions might lead us for Part 3. I've no doubt that just like Rebirth, Part 3 will have an even deeper and more complex combat system than its predecessor had. The only question now is, how long before we see it? We can't be far off a name reveal and a teaser trailer. Considering Nomura and Hamaguchi apparently just decided on the final subtitle, the wait sure is a killer though, and I feel like I say this at the end of every video. As always, thanks for spending some of your internet time on me today, and if you like the content, please stick around. A like and a subscription really helps the channel grow. Drop me a comment and let me know your thoughts or any feedback and suggestions, and I really hope to see you guys in the next one.